Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Igniting the Inclusive Workforce session. Today we're talking about Americans with Disabilities Act and how Olmstead and ADAAA applies to employees with disabilities. My name is Todd Herman, and I lead development and community relations for the Bobby Dodd Institute. And we're thrilled to have you here joining us for the next 45 minutes or so. I'll skip over to the next slide. Hopefully I can toggle here. Here we go. First off, we just want to thank our sponsors and supporters, starting with generosity from the Atlanta Foundation. Of course, the Bobby Dodd Institute has been behind the IIW since its very beginning. And we also want to thank Disability Inn of Greater Atlanta and Georgia Tech's Excel program and the Institute for Leadership and Social Impact. And finally, we want to express our gratitude to our friends at MARTA for their support of Igniting the Inclusive Workforce. So today's session, we are thrilled to be joined by Julie Kegley and Pam Williamson. I wanted to briefly introduce them. So Pamela Williamson serves as the Assistant Director of the Southeast ADA Center. That is based in Atlanta, Georgia. So the Southeast ADA Center is a member of the ADA National Network and is funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. And this center is located in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. But a little bit more on Ms. Williamson. She has expertise on the Americans with Disabilities Act, supported employment. This includes disability as part of diversity in the workplace. She's also well-versed in building effective grassroots networks, special education services, and aging populations. She is a board member of the Association of People Supporting Employment First, or the APSE for short. And Pam is sought out by multiple organizations for her training expertise on the ADA. Ms. Williamson identifies as a person with a disability and has been involved with people with disabilities on a personal and professional level for most of her life. So we welcome Pam as one of our speakers. And I also wanted to introduce Julie, who's a senior staff attorney and program director with the Georgia Advocacy Office. This is a federally funded, private, nonprofit designated by the governor of Georgia to protect and advocate on behalf of people with disabilities. So for almost 20 years, Julie has represented hundreds of people with disabilities on a variety of issues, such as removing restricted guardianships, working to achieve competitive, integrated employment, ensuring effective communication in the healthcare and legal settings, and ensuring people with disabilities obtain medical waiver services so they can live successfully in the community. Julie is licensed to practice law in Georgia, Virginia, and Alabama. Long story short, two excellent people with a lot of depth of expertise are going to be leading us through this session. And without further ado, I would love to turn it over to Pam to get us started. Pam?
Todd, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and I appreciate you and Katie inviting us to speak today. Bobby Dodd Institute has long been a leader in these issues, and so it's exciting to be here. And I'm also excited to be with my colleague from Georgia Advocacy Office, Julie Kegley. So she and I are enjoying the co-presenting today. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please.
Sorry, it's a little glitchy. There we go.
Okay, so, well, when we start talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act and looking at employment and other things, it's important that we set the stage early. And I call this building the foundation. We want, because the ADA is a civil rights law, but unfortunately, I don't know about you, but sometimes I'm like, okay, I've heard this term all of my life, but what does it really mean? So I've gone into the dictionary, and the term civil rights actually refers to the basic rights afforded by the laws of the government to every person, regardless of race, nationality, color, gender, age, religion, or disability. It's rights such as equal citizenship, equal protection under the law, and due process. So, in other words, to put it in a little simpler language, civil rights really means that a person should have equal access to all things related to the legal process, economic self sufficiency, and community participation, regardless of any of the factors such as race, nationality, color, gender, age, religion, or disability. Now, the United Nations does go on further to state that these basic rights also include the right to life and liberty, freedom from slavery and torture, freedom of opinion and expression, and the right to work and be educated, and so much more. And they also go on to state that all of this should happen without discrimination. So when you're looking at civil rights laws, there's four characteristics we've got to look at, because civil rights laws have long been known for the things that happen, the changes that occur, but these don't happen without a bit of emotionalism, because when a person or a group of people are advocating for their civil rights, emotions are going to be involved. There's no way to keep them out, because you can range from very happy or excited that something good is happening to disgust or just even being hot mad. And so it's one of these issues that we've been battling for a long time. Emotions can run high, people get excited, and sometimes they'll get the best of us. So let's think about this. You've got a person with a disability who feels like their civil rights have been violated versus an entity such as a business or employer. And that business or employer wants to feel that their services or work environment won't be changed because of a request for an accommodation or a reasonable modification to policy or procedure. And many times it can get very heated. So it's really important that we take a step back and that we look at these things from all sides and really try to calm down the emotionally charged atmosphere so that we can discuss the situation. And, when we discuss these situations, it leads to balance and compromise. It really looks at balancing the rights of people with disabilities against the entity's ability to really maintain the functions of their programs or services. We don't get everything we want. I had to remind my children of that growing up. It's not about getting everything you want. It's about a process of negotiation and consensus building so that results in requirements that are agreed upon by everyone who's involved. Even the ADA was built through negotiation, balance, and compromise. I encourage you to look at the document put out by the National Council on Disability called Equality of Opportunity, the Making of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It really talks about how Senators Kennedy and Harkin really made a commitment to make sure that this would be a law that was supported on all sides by all members of both the Republican and Democratic parties. And there was the ultimate goal to be able to pass an enforceable law. So they really had many extensive discussions with all the parties to reach important compromises before they ever even introduced the bill. The other thing about civil rights laws is that they have to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. The beauty of the ADA is that it's not a one-size-fits-all law. Each person or situation is unique. And so the determination of whether or not an individual has a disability needs to be made on a case-by-case basis. And then you've also got things that you need to look at about whether or not the reasonableness of an accommodation request, is reasonable for that person and that situation. Because sometimes you're just not going to have the ability to do everything that a person wants. And that's the reason, too, as you're looking at this case-by-case analysis, you truly need a context, because there are some terms in the ADA that are kind of vague. What does reasonable mean? what's reasonable for one might not be reasonable for another. And think about it, about what's reasonable for a small mom and pop organization may be unreasonable for a small mom and pop organization, may be very reasonable for a large retailer that has stores all over the country. Now, we know that civil rights are unique. But we also know that, when we're looking at civil rights, and we talked about the fact that they have really been the impetus for change in our country, but there are some components that we need to look at when it comes to change. We've got to look at our values, because our decisions are based on our values. We all bring those to the table, whether we realize it or not. But we also bring our biases to the table, the things that we may or may not embrace. So we have to believe that people with disabilities have the right to work in the career of their choice for which they're qualified, have equal access to programs and services, be able to live in the community. All those things that we value, really make the difference. And if you value all of these things already, then the Americans with Disabilities Act and these concepts are not going to be something that's foreign to you, that you will be ready to accept these changes. And also, too, when we value something, it really makes it easier to identify solutions that create a win-win, both for people with disabilities and business. But let's be honest here, values really are the hardest thing to adjust, because the values affect our attitudes. And many people with disabilities will say that the values and attitudes of an employer or business are a bigger barrier than the facility itself or things happening around them. But with our values, we have to become aware. We need to be aware of the barriers that exist, address the issues. Many times, businesses or employers just really don't know about the specific accessibility issues until someone asks for an accommodation or brings it to their attention. And, as a person with a disability, I'm the one who's an expert on my needs. I can't expect my employer or or a business owner or others to read my mind. So it's important that although an employer or business may be meeting the specific ADA requirements, there are going to be times when they need to be better understand what that person's specific need is. Again, going back to the case-by-case analysis. And then we have to have the skills. Once you're aware of a situation, you need the skills and tools to help resolve the issues to everyone's satisfaction. And you can build those skills so many ways. Attending webinars like this. I'm excited you're here today. I'm thrilled to know that you want to learn more. And then you can also, read publications, contact the Southeast ADA Center and other organizations, and really increase your skills so that you can address these things. Next slide, please. We've addressed civil rights, what they are, what they look like and everything. And sometimes people often forget that, disability rights are civil rights. Now, my daddy was a math teacher. And even though I am a daddy's girl, I'll be the first one to tell you that his mathematics genetics did not make their way into my DNA. But the one thing he taught me that stuck with me, especially as I was trying to solve those horrible word problems in math throughout the years, is that the word is or are always means an equal sign. And so as we look at this, we've got to remember that disability rights do equal or are civil rights, and we've got to be able to look at that. Now, as we've talked about civil rights, we need to look at our disability history. Unfortunately, we've had a long history of biased assumptions about people, of what they can and can't do because of a disability. We have harmful stereotypes that have been perpetuated. We've got irrational fears. And then we also have a history of isolating and segregating people with disabilities. And I work for the Burton Blatt Institute at Syracuse University, and they're the administrative entity of the Southeast ADA Center. And, one of the reasons I am proud to work for them is because it is named after Burton Blatt, who was a pioneer in exposing these issues about isolation and segregation. And he and a photographer around Christmas of 1965 went into 4 institutions across the Northeast, documenting issues of where people had been put into institutions, and they went into what they called the back wards, and really brought the national attention to the abuse of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the institutions. And so that was documented in something called Christmas in Purgatory, and I'll provide that information in a little bit. But I really, but unfortunately, we continue to see issues, and we continue to hear stories of things like this that are happening. Now, this slide and the next 2 actually have just a highlight of various legislation and standards that have been passed since 1942 until now. And we started with the vocational rehabilitation amendments back in 1942, and this was a result of our soldiers who were returning from World War II. And these folks were coming home and saying, I'm going to go back to work. And, there were a lot of employers saying, well, you can't work. And so these veterans got together and said, yes, I can, and yes, I will. And so we really can thank our military folks for helping to get us started in the right direction. Then we see the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and it does not include disability, but it is so important as our foundation. And then we go on through and have the Rehabilitation Act and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Next slide, please. Oh, you got it. And then, we've got the Air Carrier Access Act, Fair Housing, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the ADA Amendments Act that we're talking about today, on into the ADA standards for accessible design. And then in the last few years, we have seen the Achieving a Better Life Experience Act, also known as the ABLE Act, allowing people to save money that is not taxed, and really looking towards being able to save without penalty. And then the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act and several others. So, and I know that there's some more that are coming down the pipeline. So I look forward to being able to add to my timeline here in the next year or so. Now, as we talked about, years and years have been spent studying this issue, identifying solutions, but unfortunately, people do continue to be excluded. And, it really truly amazes me that in 2021, we're still seeing barriers to access, and people with disabilities are still fighting for some of these basic civil rights of access to employment, communication, state and local government programs, medical care, and the right to a living wage, to be able to live independently and participate in the community. So one of the things that we see is that they continue to be excluded. The COVID pandemic actually brought this to light in the medical arena. And in July 2020, NPR talked about Michael Hickson, a 46-year-old man with quadriplegia who had COVID-19. And he was at a hospital in Texas. And on June 11th, the hospital ended treatment for him and moved him from ICU to hospice care. And basically, his family was told, we're making this decision because we don't feel like he would have quality of life. So Mr. Hickson and his family were excluded from making a decision about his life based on someone else's opinion that he would not have quality of life. Then we have stereotypes. So if you can go back one slide, please. Then we have stereotypes. Stereotypes about disabilities continue, and the media really portrays people, particularly people with psychiatric disabilities, in a horrible, horrible way. And so there was a 2018 journal article titled Media and Mental Health, and it stated that media consistently portrays persons with mental illness as violent, murderous, unpredictable, and have themselves to blame for their condition are gross, and these are gross exaggerations and misrepresentations of reality and completely untrue. So this has led to the belief that all people with psychiatric disabilities are uncontrollable, dangerous, and to be avoided. And, for me as a person with a psychiatric disability, when I see those stories, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, no wonder people are continue to be afraid to talk about our mental health. And then we also still have limited opportunities for people to work and live in the community, because we've seen this with extensive waiting list, and for people to be able to move into the community. And then also too, physical barriers remain. Even though most of the regulations and the ADA standards for accessible design went into effect in 1992, we still have places that have physical barriers.
Hi, Pam. This is Todd. I just want to interrupt you. We had a question come in asking about the case of Mr. Hicks that you referred to, and the question was, did he have a healthcare power of attorney, and whether you knew that.
So the article did not state whether or not he had a healthcare power of attorney. However, I will let you know that I have been the healthcare power of attorney in a situation over the past year, and even as vocal an advocate as I am, I would not have been able to move the needle forward in the right direction if I had not had contacts that could help support me. So, it's out there, because I am a healthcare power of attorney for an individual with a disability. An older individual with a disability. So she's got 2 strikes against her. Okay, so let's talk about what this means. So when this exclusion for people with disabilities either means they're unemployed or underemployed. Again, they're unfairly perceived. They're a drain on society. My taxes are going to go up. I've got to pay more. Folks are stigmatized. We talked about the media portrayal of people with psychiatric disabilities, and folks continue to experience discrimination in many, many areas of their life. The general public at times tends to think that, disability and people with disabilities are a very minor part of the population. So why should we care? But yet President George W. Bush in 2001 stated that disability is not the experience of a minority of Americans. Rather, it is an experience that will touch most Americans at some point during their lives. Now, if we were in a room together, I would typically ask the question, if you know someone with a person with a disability, and the numbers typically are running pretty consistent. About 21% of the country is a person with a disability. However, we know that number is lower than the actual number. So just because people are afraid to disclose. So, it really is something that is affecting many people in many ways across the country, whether you're the person with the disability or and interact with that person on a regular basis. So this leads us to the Americans with Disabilities Act. What is it, and why does it matter? Now, as we talked earlier about civil rights, it's a civil rights law passed in 1990. In July of this year, on July 26th, we will celebrate the 31st anniversary. And it was really the first law that looked at providing equal opportunity for people with disabilities in employment, state and local government, and then for the first time, private businesses, even if they didn't have a contract with the federal government. And the goal of the law was truly the full inclusion of people with disabilities in all aspects of American society. we've talked briefly about these topics before, but really the ADA has 4 pillars or 4 foundational principles. And one is that it's about equal opportunity. You want a person to be able to have the same equal access as anyone else. Now, I want to remind you, equal opportunity does not mean equal results. So because, and that's one of the things that, I like to remind folks of, because, just because I have the equal opportunity to go play basketball at my local recreation center does not mean I am going to be equally as good as Michael Jordan. Just not going to happen. So then you've got economic self-sufficiency, because as one of the foundations, people with disabilities, they want to work, they want to be able to earn the monies that they need. They need supports to live in the community, possibly, but that doesn't have to impact all of the benefits that are there. And so there needs to be that balance and compromise that we talk about. And then full participation in American life. This means the right to vote, the right to eat out with friends, the right to go to accessible places, the right to be able to work. All of these kinds of things that sometimes we take for granted. And then the opportunity to live independently. And that's where Olmstead comes in so beautifully. And Julie will go into more detail on that in a minute. As a follow-up, there was another law passed in 2008. It's the Americans with Disabilities Amendments Act, and it really made changes to the meaning of the ADA definition of disability. Because there have been several Supreme Court decisions that had really watered down the analysis of disability, and there were valid cases that were not even making it through the court systems, because so much time was spent on the person proving that he or she had a disability rather than the issue of whether or not discrimination had occurred. So overall, that means that it made it easier for a person looking for protection under the law to show that he or she had a disability. Next slide, please. Now, the ADA actually applies to several areas, and these are just a highlight here, and this is in employment, state and local government programs, public accommodations or private businesses, and this includes nonprofits, transportation, both public and private, and telecommunications. Now today, once I turn it over to Julie, we're really going to be highlighting some specifically living in the community and employment issues. And I'm going to just spend a little bit of time here about Olmstead versus LC. So if you can take me to the next slide, please. It was a Supreme Court decision in 1999, and it truly was a historic civil rights decision with people with disabilities. And it did start here in Georgia. And the ruling was that people with disabilities have a qualified right to receive state-funded supports and services in the community rather than institutions when, and there was a few caveats here, the services are appropriate. So, and that the affected persons do not oppose community-based treatment. So the persons who are asking to live in the community or being encouraged to live in the community, let's make sure that's what they really want. In other words, get the buy-in of the person that it affects the most. And then the community-based services can be reasonably accommodated, so that, and looking at the resources that are available to make it happen. These are the 3 things that, the Supreme Court really honed in on, and making sure that people with disabilities could have the right to live in the community independently with supports, and really be able to fully enjoy all of the foundational principles that the ADA set out. Now, as we look at Olmstead and look at, and we've talked about exclusion and some other things, I just want to bring to light some statistics here about people with disabilities. Now, this is from April of this year. The statistics for May will be released hopefully on Friday. Sometimes when the week comes in midweek, it gets a little messed up. But around Friday, the first Friday of each month is when they're typically released. And this is from the U.S. Department of Labor. Now, we have the unemployment rate for people with disabilities, and these are folks ages 16 and older. And they look at, people who are not working, and they're they are actively seeking work. So these are folks that are not employed at all. So we see here that people without disabilities, the unemployment rate is 5.6%, but for people with disabilities, it's 9.6%. That's a 4% difference there, and it really is showing that people with disabilities, are unemployed at a much higher rate, and yet these are folks who really want to be able to go to work. Now, the labor force participation, or the percentage of the population that is either working or actively looking for work, is mind-blowing, because people without disabilities are working in 66.8% of those folks are working. Yet with people with disabilities, only 20.3% are working. That's a gap of 46.5%. And there you really have people with disabilities that want to go to work, and yet because of discrimination or the lack of education that may have been because of the lack could be because of discrimination, then you're seeing these issues and these huge disparities. And these are some things that are very important for us to look at, because we want to be able to address them. So at this point, I am going to turn it over to Julie and let her take it away.
Thank you, Pam. My name is Julie Cagney, and I want to talk about what we are seeing nationally and in Georgia around ensuring that people with disability have access to competitive integrated employment under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. And competitive integrated employment is the competitive piece means that you are making minimum wage or greater. The integrated piece means that it's the person with a disability working alongside a person without a disability. The Olmstead case that Pam talked about is the case where the United States Supreme Court affirmed a state's obligation to provide covered program services to people with disabilities in the most integrated setting appropriate to their needs. In 2012, the Lane case was filed in Oregon. This was the first class action in the country that challenged sheltered workshops as a violation of the ADA. The case was brought on behalf of thousands of people with disabilities in Oregon's segregated sheltered workshops. Many made less than $1 an hour. The judge in that case held that the integration mandate of the ADA applies to employment settings just like residential settings. This means that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities must receive employment services in integrated settings, not sheltered workshops. In 2014, we had the Henry's Turkey Farm case. This is just a heartbreaking story of how 32 men with intellectual and developmental disabilities lived together in an abandoned schoolhouse. They worked in an Iowa turkey processing plant, Henry's Turkey Farm. They worked there for over 30 years, and they made only $65 a month. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission filed suit against the turkey farm, and a verdict of over $1.6 million was entered. And it was more, but the $1.6 million was the federal cap on damages. There's a story about this case in the New York Times, and I encourage you to read it. It's called The Brain in the Bank House. Home and community-based studying rule became effective in 2013. These federal laws describe how home and community-based services for people with developmental disabilities are provided. Home and community-based studying are places where people with disabilities spend their days. This includes licensed community care facilities, residential studying, work activity programs, and day programs. The purpose of the law, among other things, is to ensure that people with disabilities have the opportunity to seek employment in competitive integrated studying and have full access to the greater community. Every state must make sure that its home and community-based studying services are in compliance with the new law by March of next year, 2022, or they will not receive federal funding for these services. Section 14C of the Fair Labor Standards Act authorizes employers who receive a certificate from the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division to pay wages less than the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour to workers who have disabilities. We call this sub-minimum wage. The Wage and Hour Division makes it clear that the Section 14C sub-minimum wage certificate program should not be the first or primary option for employment of people with disabilities. In 2018, there were 141,000 people with disabilities paid under a Section 14C certificate. The average wage of a person with a disability paid under the 14C was $3.33 an hour. A person working under a 14C certificate is usually somebody that's working in a sheltered workshop. These are known as community rehabilitation programs. These are typically big warehouses where people with disabilities work meaningless jobs, doing piecemeal work alongside other people with disabilities all making below minimum wage. Nationally, Congress is recognizing the need to eliminate 14C, and they know that people with disabilities should be working alongside people without disabilities in an integrated setting, making minimum wage or greater. In 2020, the United States Commission on Civil Rights called for phasing out 14C sub-minimum wage. 7 states in the country have now either phased out sheltered workshops that pay sub-minimum wage, or they are in the process of doing so. There are 2 bills in Congress currently addressing the elimination of 14C certificates: the Transformation to Competitive Employment Act and the Raise the Wage Act. The Transformation to Competitive Employment Act would discontinue the issuance of 14C certificates to new applicants, provide capacity building grants and technical assistance to help state and 14C certificate holders to transform their business model to result in competitive integrated employment, and sunset 14C so that 5 years after the act is passed, employers can no longer pay people with disabilities sub-minimum wage. The Raise the Wage Act of 2021 would increase the minimum wage in 5 steps over 5 years to $15 an hour by the year 2025. As you may know, the current federal minimum wage has not been raised in over 10 years. This act would also eliminate sub-minimum wages to people with disabilities under Section 14C of the Fair Labor Standards Act. In Georgia, we have 18 sheltered workshops that pay 638 people with disabilities sub-minimum wage. These workshops are all over the state, but primarily in rural areas. In one workshop, I saw people with disabilities cleaning coat hangers, and I asked why were they cleaning coat hangers. I was told that the workshop had a contract with the local dry cleaning business where people with disabilities would wipe down the coat hangers for use in between customers. They were making pennies on the dollar. Another workshop had a contract with the local newspaper to insert sale papers inside the newspaper. Another had people with disabilities tearing out pages of old school books to be used for recycling. The workshop also were paying people depending on how productive they were per hour. 45 states in the nation have some form of employment first initiative, legislation, or executive order. Employment first is the framework for system change that envisions that all people, including people with significant disabilities, are capable of full participation in integrated employment and community life. Georgia's Employment First Act was signed into law in 2018. The legislation established employment as the first and preferred option for people with disabilities who want to work. The bill created a 14-member council that will make recommendations for policy and legislative action around employment first. And so that concludes Pam and Man's presentation to all of you. We are so thankful that you came today. We have listed the contact information for the Southeast ADA Center in my office, the Georgia Advocacy Office. We have also listed resources. We encourage you to contact us after the presentation if you have questions or anything that you want to run by us. But now I believe we're going to have about 5 minutes for questions and answers, and I will turn it over to Todd.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you, Julie, and wonderful job as well, Pam. Obviously, as I said before, these two experts, they know their stuff, and we appreciate you providing your expertise for this session. So we did have a question come through, so I wanted to share that with you. There's a preface to it, and starts with, COVID has shown us that many people are earning below a living standard, as evidenced by so many not wanting to leave the unemployment rolls to rejoin the workforce. These new laws are encouraging, yet there will still be a living wage gap for individuals with disabilities. Are there any states with creative programs that provide a way for a person to work and not lose state benefits so that they can live with dignity?
This is Julie. I know that Washington State had a very good initiative for employing people with disabilities. I don't recall the creative piece is right up the top of my head, but Washington State is a leader in this field.
And this is Pam, just to follow up what Julie said. There's an organization named WISE, W-I-S-E, and I will see if I can find their website for you. They are actually located in Washington, but they do consulting across the nation. And actually, they're a contractor through the Georgia Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities here in Georgia, and trying to help implement some of their creativity here and really move us in the right direction. So, but I encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about what's happening in the state of Washington and in other states, to look at their training schedule. It is very robust and has a lot of excellent information. But I'll see if I can find that for you momentarily.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Julie, again. And this comes to the conclusion of our session today. Our next Igniting the Inclusive Workforce webinar will be on Wednesday, September 1st. All be about social integration. And we have two presenters. One, Crystal Bohannon and her team. There's going to be multiple people from KSU and the Academy and Wellstar College of Health and Human Services, and then Myrna Clayton, who is the founder and executive director of Showability. So we hope you can join us for that. And in the meantime, please stay connected with us, learn about new sessions and things that are upcoming regarding the Igniting the Inclusive Workforce. So thank you very much again, and we'll see you in a couple of months. Thank you again, Pam and Julie.
Thank you. Bye-bye.